What's up everyone? In this video, we're going to get started with Tailwind CSS in a Next.js project. Before we get started though, make sure you're subscribed to my channel and getting notifications so you never miss when I release a video about Tailwind, payloadcms, Next.js, and more. If you want the code for what I'm doing today, you can find it in the repo linked in the description. Now, let's dive in. Getting started with Tailwind CSS for Next.js is simple. The Tailwind team has provided clear instructions not just for Next.js, but also for a variety of other popular environments. There are examples for PHP and Ruby frameworks, as well as other JavaScript frameworks like Astro, Angular, and Nuxt. Though I don't see any specific guides for Flask or Django for Python. Typically with Tailwind, you'll start by creating a new project. You simply run the normal create next app command to create the project and then navigate to it. In our case though, we have this payloadcms project we've been using, so we'll continue to use this and skip that initial project creation. Now we'll install Tailwind CSS by running npm add tailwind css at tailwind css /postcss and postcss. We'll let that install the necessary dependencies we need. Then we'll need to create a new file called postcss.config.mjs in our root directory, which for us is blank payload. So we'll create a new file called postcss.config.mjs. And in here, we can create a config const and open up a new object that takes a plugins object. And in here, we need to write in tailwind css /postcss and assign it to an empty object. We'll then export our default config. If you don't already have a globals.css, we'll need to create that in our app folder. Here we'll create a new style sheet, call it globals. And in here we can import Tailwind CSS. And then we need to go to our layout.tsx and import our globals.css. So now if we save this and run pnpm dev, we should be able to load up our blog page. And right away, we can see that our text has changed in style. It is no longer serif, it is now sans serif. And we can see that by commenting out our globals.css and letting the page refresh. Now, before we get too deep into code, let's talk about what importing Tailwind CSS does and the best practices you should consider before spinning up your development server. When you import Tailwind CSS, you import all of Tailwind CSS. And this may not be what you want, especially if you already have existing styles you don't want overwritten. By default, Tailwind automatically injects some base styles that you can override if you'd like. These styles are called Preflight. Some of the changes provided by Preflight are surprising when you first see them. For example, headings and lists come unstyled. You will need to manually add styles to these in order for them to reflect what you expect those elements to look like. And for accessibility, you'll need to add the role equals list attribute to any unstyled list so your lists are still announced by screen readers. Some other changes just make it so things work like they should. Default margins are removed, images are set to display block and are constrained, and border styles are reset. These styles typically make it easier to declare what you want rather than relying on built-in browser styles. You have the option to control what is used in your project by explicitly including what Tailwind injects by default, which looks something like this. So we'll go back over to our globals.css, and instead of importing Tailwind CSS, we'll call out each individual theme, preflight, and utilities.css in our import statements, and allow these layers to be declared here. When we refresh, we see now that our styles have been reapplied, and I can remove Preflight if I'd like, and see all of the Preflight base styles be removed. So we'll leave that on. Now you can also extend the base styles by using @layer base below the layers here. So we'll do @layer base and extend by adding a new h1 style, which we will do font size, and then we'll use the Tailwind variable text to XL. And so in order for this to work, we'll need to add in our blog posts an h1. So we'll do that by going to our blog 1 and change test text left to be a heading 1, publish these changes, and then refresh. So now we can see that the text is 2XL, but if I remove this H1, it reverts back to just like normal body text there. So we'll leave that in just so we have a way of determining when something is an H1. One more quick note before getting started with code. You can set up your code editor to autocomplete Tailwind CSS code. If you're using VS Code, you can use the official Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin, which includes a Tailwind CSS mode that supports all custom rules and functions that Tailwind uses. You may need to disable some linting rules if your editor is strict about CSS syntax, though. If you're using a JetBrains code editor, something like WebStorm, or in my case, PyCharm, you'll want to make sure you're on at least version 2024.3.2. Otherwise, JetBrains won't recognize the autocomplete. Then you should make sure your CSS and Tailwind CSS bundled plugins are enabled by going to Settings, so PyCharm, Settings, and then Plugins. And so when you're in your Settings plugins, you can scroll or search for CSS, and we can see that we have our bundled CSS plugin and our bundled Tailwind CSS plugin enabled. So I can just hit OK, and my Tailwind autocomplete should work like normal. In both cases, having your code editor recognize Tailwind CSS can speed up your development because it provides autocomplete, linting, syntax highlights, and previews of the actual CSS each utility class uses when you hover over the snippet. Let's give this a shot. So we're going to go to our Content with Media component, and we're going to do some refactoring here. So first things first, let's delete this else if block here and the if statement here. We're going to refactor this component completely so it looks cleaner and we're able to make easy edits just with one component instead of using an if-else statement. In our section, we can add a class name which is going to be set equal to grid. Grid calls 12, gap 4, M4, P4. We'll use BG Emerald 400. Rounded to XL. So what this is doing is it's telling Tailwind to apply a 12-column grid with a 1 rem gap between each column. This includes a margin and a padding of 1 rem, rounding the edges by 1 rem, and applying an emerald-colored background. From a previous video, our rich text currently has its container disabled, so we'll jump over to that component real quick, remove this TS ignore, because that issue has been fixed, and remove our disable container equals true. We'll go back over to the component. In our rich text, we'll add a class name and set that equal to call span 3. And in our image, we'll do class name call span 9. Now what this does is it tells the children elements to take up 3 columns for the rich text and 9 columns for the image. We'll hit save and let the styles load up, and we can see just how quickly things start to come together. Now, instead of changing order by creating 2 options, we can now add an order last to the first element if block.textPosition equals right. So we'll change these single quotes to backticks so I can open up a dynamic value here where we'll take our block text position equals right. And if that's true, we'll return order last. But if not, we'll do order first. So now I save this and I can see that my text position right has flipped to the other side and we have everything written into this nice clean component here. And that's it. That's how easy it is to get started with Tailwind CSS. A few commands and an import or 2 and you're good to go. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Check to make sure you're subscribed to my channel and receiving notifications so you never miss when I release more content around Tailwind CSS, payloadcms, Next.js, and more. If you have suggestions or questions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.